wind tore through the fishing village of Wren Hollow like something alive, ripping shutters from their hinges and flattening the tall grass along the cliffs. Rain fell in sheets so thick that no one dared step outside, except for one woman, who never seemed to fear the storm at all. She was already moving through the dark when she heard it, a heavy sound, like a body falling against wood. She lifted her lantern and found him at her door, a tall man in a torn coat, blood soaking through the fabric at his side, his face pale as bone. He was not from Wren Hollow. His boots were too fine, his hands too smooth, but none of that mattered to her in that moment. What mattered was that his lips were turning blue, and his breath was shallow and fading. She pulled him inside without a single question, dragging his weight across her threshold with strength that surprised even her. The storm slammed the door shut behind them, as if sealing their fates together. By the light of a single candle, she cut away his shirt and pressed clean cloth against the wound in his side. It was deep, the kind of wound that came from a blade, not an accident. She did not ask how he got it. She had learned long ago that questions only slowed her hands, and slow hands lost lives. This was not the first time a stranger had appeared broken at her door. It was not even the fifth. In 2 years, she had pulled 8 people back from the edge of death in this village. People the town doctor had already given up on. People whose families had already begun to grieve. She never asked for payment. She never asked for gratitude. She only asked that they leave her alone once they were well again. The villagers called her many things: the healer, the quiet one, the woman on the cliff. No one called her by her name, because no one knew it. She had made certain of that when she arrived in Wren Hollow, with nothing but a bag of herbs and a past she refused to speak of. Through the night, she worked over the stranger's body, boiling water, grinding herbs into paste, murmuring instructions to herself as though rehearsing them from memory. His fever rose just after midnight, and his body began to shake so violently that she had to hold him down with all her weight. She whispered to him then, not comforting words but firm ones, the kind a person uses to command someone to keep breathing. "Stay," she said. "You are not finished yet." He did not answer, of course. He could not hear her. But something in her voice seemed to reach him anyway, because his shaking slowed, and his breath steadied, just enough. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving the village washed clean and silent. She sat beside the stranger with her back against the wall, too tired to move, watching the rise and fall of his chest to make sure it did not stop. His face, no longer twisted in pain, looked younger than she had first thought. There was something unguarded about him now, something almost gentle, though she suspected that gentleness would vanish the moment he woke, and remembered whatever trouble had put a blade in his side. She did not sleep. She never allowed herself to sleep fully when a life hung in the balance. Instead, she watched the light change outside her small window, watched the fishermen begin their morning walk to the docks, watched the world continue as if nothing had happened, as if a man had not nearly died on her floor in the night. It was nearly noon when his eyes opened. She saw it happen slowly, the flutter of his lashes, the confusion crossing his face as he took in the low ceiling, the smell of herbs, the unfamiliar room. His gaze moved across the space until it landed on her, and there it stopped. She expected fear. Strangers often woke frightened, unsure whether they had survived or simply moved into some strange afterlife. She expected him to ask where he was, or what had happened to him, or who had done this to him. Instead, his voice came out rough and quiet, but steady. "What is your name?" She blinked, caught off guard by the simplicity of the question. In 2 years, in 8 lives saved, no one had ever asked her that first. They asked where they were. They asked about their wounds, their belongings, their horses. They thanked her, sometimes with tears, sometimes with coin she refused to take. But none of them had ever looked at her, truly looked at her, and asked the one thing she had spent years making sure no one needed to know. "I did not think that mattered," she said carefully, avoiding his eyes as she checked the bandage at his side. "It matters to me," he said. She said nothing for a long moment, busying her hands with the cloth, pretending the question had not unsettled her as much as it had. When she finally looked up, she found him still watching her, patient, waiting, as though he had all the time in the world despite the fact that he had nearly lost his life only hours before. "You should rest," she said instead. "You lost a great deal of blood. Your fever may return." He studied her face for a moment longer, then let his head fall back against the pillow, though his eyes stayed open, fixed on the ceiling. "I will ask again when I am stronger," he said. "I intend to know the name of the woman who saved my life." She almost smiled at that, though she caught herself before it reached her lips. There was something different about him, something she could not quite name, in the way he spoke, in the way his eyes held hers without the usual mixture of pity or awkwardness that strangers often carried when they realized a woman alone had been the one to save them. She busied herself preparing a broth from what little she had, glancing at him now and then as he drifted in and out of a light sleep. His hands, she noticed, were calloused in places but soft in others, as though he had spent his life switching between hard labor and something far gentler. His clothes, though ruined by blood and rain, were made of fine wool, stitched by a tailor's careful hand, not the rough cloth worn by the fishermen and farmers of Wren Hollow. He was not who he appeared to be, she was certain of that, but she had learned not to ask, because the truth people carried was often heavier than the wounds on their bodies, and she preferred to heal the body first, and let the truth reveal itself in its own time, if it ever did at all. By evening, his fever had not returned, though he remained weak, drifting between sleep and waking, as his body worked to repair itself. She fed him broth spoonful by spoonful when he was too tired to lift the bowl himself, and though he barely had the strength to speak, his eyes followed her every movement around the small cottage, as though trying to understand the woman who had pulled him back from the edge of death, without asking for anything in return. Late that night, as she sat mending a torn net by candlelight, a task she often did for the fishermen in exchange for fish and bread, he spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "You did not answer me before." She kept her eyes on the net in her hands, her fingers moving through familiar knots. "Some things are better left unanswered," she said. "Why?" he asked. "Is your name one of them?" She paused, the needle still between her fingers, and for the first time in a long while, she found herself considering the question honestly, rather than deflecting it as she always did. "Because a name carries a person's whole history with it," she finally said, "and I left my history behind a long time ago." He was quiet after that, though she could feel him watching her, turning her words over as though searching for the meaning hidden beneath them. She expected him to press further, the way most people did when they sensed a wound they could not see, curious in the way people are curious about scars. Instead, he simply said, "Then I will wait until you are ready to give it back to yourself." The words settled over her in a way she did not expect, quiet and unhurried, without demand or pity. She glanced at him then, really looked at him for the first time since the storm had brought him to her door, and found none of the usual hunger for information that most strangers carried, only patience, and something that looked almost like respect. She did not know his name either, she realized. She had been so consumed with keeping him alive that she had never thought to ask, and strangely, in that moment, she found that she wanted to know it, not out of duty or curiosity about his wounds, but because she wanted to know the man who had asked for her name before anything else. But the night was late, and his strength was still fragile, and questions, she reminded herself, could wait until morning. She set the net aside and moved to check his bandage one final time before the candle burned low. As she leaned over him, he caught her wrist gently, his grip weak but certain. "Thank you," he said, "for the 9th time in whatever number of years you have done this." She stilled at that, surprised he had guessed at the pattern of her life so quickly, though perhaps it was not so difficult to guess for a man who had clearly spent his life reading people carefully. "How did you know?" she asked. "Because a person does not move the way you move tonight, calm within chaos, unless they have done it many times before," he said. "And because a person who has saved that many lives without asking anything for herself is usually running from something far bigger than gratitude." She pulled her wrist gently from his grasp, unsettled by how closely his words had landed to the truth, though she said nothing to confirm or deny it. Instead, she blew out the candle, leaving the cottage in darkness broken only by the pale light of the moon through the window. "Sleep now," she said. "There will be time for questions when the sun rises." But long after his breathing had settled into the slow rhythm of sleep, she remained awake, staring into the dark, turning his question over in her mind like a stone she could not put down. "What is your name?" No one had asked her that in 2 years. No one had cared enough to ask. And yet this stranger, bleeding and broken at her door, had asked it before he had even known if he would survive the night. She did not know what that meant yet, but she knew, somehow, that nothing in her quiet, hidden life would remain quite the same now that he had asked. Outside, the storm had long since passed, but something in the stillness of the night felt like the beginning of another kind of storm altogether, one that would not announce itself with wind and rain, but with questions she had spent years running from, and a man determined to wait, however long it took, for her to finally answer them. 3 days passed before the stranger could sit up on his own, and in that time, she learned more about the shape of his character than she had learned about any patient in years. He did not complain, even when the pain in his side must have been sharp enough to steal his breath. He did not order her about, the way some wounded men did when they mistook her care for servitude. Instead, he watched her, quietly, carefully, the way a man studies something he does not yet understand but is determined to. On the fourth morning, she found him attempting to stand on his own, one hand braced against the wall, his jaw tight with effort and pain. "You will open the wound again if you insist on being foolish," she said, crossing the room quickly to steady him before his legs gave out beneath him. He allowed her to guide him back to the narrow bed, though his pride seemed to bristle at needing the help. "I have never been very good at staying still," he admitted, once he was seated again, breathing hard from the small effort. "That much is clear," she said, checking the bandage at his side, relieved to find the wound had not torn despite his stubbornness. "You are lucky the blade missed anything vital. Another inch, and I would not have been able to save you." "Then I am grateful it missed," he said, watching her hands work with quiet fascination. "Where did you learn to do this?" "Wren Hollow is a small village. I doubt it has physicians capable of teaching such skill." She kept her eyes on her work, though the question settled uncomfortably in her chest. "I learned before I came here," she said simply, offering nothing more. He seemed to sense the wall rising between them, because he did not press further, though she could feel his curiosity lingering in the silence that followed. Instead, he changed course, asking about the village itself, about the fishermen whose voices drifted up from the docks each morning, about the old church bell that rang each evening at dusk. She found herself answering more freely than she expected, telling him about old Ned, the fisherman who had lost 3 fingers to a shark years ago and now told the story differently every time he was asked. She told him about Mira, a young girl in the village who had nearly died of fever the previous winter, one of her 9 lives saved, and who now followed her around like a shadow whenever she was allowed. She told him about the bakery at the edge of the village, run by a widow named Constance, who left bread at her door every week without being asked, in quiet thanks for a debt she never spoke of aloud. As the days passed, their conversations grew longer, stretching from morning until the candle burned low each night. She noticed things about him she had not noticed before, the way his eyes softened when he spoke of the sea, though he claimed to have no experience with it, the way his hands, though clearly unused to labor, seemed eager to help her with small tasks around the cottage despite his weakened state. "You do not have to help," she told him one afternoon, when she found him attempting to stack firewood with his uninjured arm. "I want to," he said. "I have spent most of my life watching others work while I did nothing useful. It is not a feeling I care for." She studied him for a moment, curious despite herself. "What is it you do, then, when you are not nearly dying at strangers' doors?" Something flickered across his face, quick and guarded, before he answered. "I manage matters that are not entirely my own," he said carefully. "Obligations, expectations, things I did not choose but cannot escape." "That sounds like a heavy way to live," she said. "It is," he admitted, "which is part of why I left, before this happened." She wanted to ask more, wanted to press into the shadows behind his words the way he had once pressed into hers, but she held herself back, remembering her own reluctance to speak of the past. Some doors, she had learned, needed to be opened slowly, or not at all. That evening, as she prepared a simple meal of fish and bread, he watched her from his seat by the fire, his expression thoughtful in a way that made her feel, for the first time in years, as though someone was truly paying attention to her, rather than simply grateful for her hands. "You still have not told me your name," he said quietly. She glanced at him, surprised he had returned to the question after days of silence on the matter. "I did not think you had forgotten." "I have not forgotten anything about you," he said, and something in the way he said it made her pulse quicken in a manner she was not prepared for. She set the plate of food before him, avoiding his eyes as she searched for a way to deflect the question once more. But this time, the words would not come as easily as they had before. Perhaps it was the exhaustion of holding herself closed for so many years. Perhaps it was the quiet steadiness in his gaze, so unlike the pity or curiosity she usually met. Or perhaps it was simply that, for the first time since she had arrived in Wren Hollow, she wanted someone to know her, truly know her, rather than simply know what she could do for them. "It is Eliza," she said finally, the word feeling strange on her tongue after so long unused. "Eliza Marsh." Something in his face softened at the sound of it, as though he had been waiting for that single word longer than the days he had spent recovering in her cottage. "Eliza," he repeated, testing the shape of it. "It suits you." She felt her cheeks warm despite herself, unused to such simple, direct attention. "And what of you?" she asked, turning the question back toward him. "You know my name now. It seems only fair that I know yours." He hesitated then, just briefly, a flicker of something crossing his face that she could not quite name. Guilt, perhaps, or fear. though she could not be certain which. "Alaric," he said finally. "My name is Alaric." "Just Alaric?" she asked, sensing there was more to it than the single word he had offered. "For now," he said. "That is enough." She let the matter rest, though she noted the way he had chosen his words carefully, the way he had given her a name without giving her the whole of himself. She understood that hesitation better than most, having spent years doing the very same thing, and so she did not push, choosing instead to trust that whatever he was not yet ready to share would come in its own time, the same way her own name had finally come to him. The days that followed brought a quiet rhythm to the cottage that Eliza had not known in years. Alaric grew stronger with each passing morning, his wound healing cleanly under her careful attention, until he was able to walk to the edge of the cliffs with her in the evenings, watching the sun sink into the sea while the fishermen brought their boats home for the night. He asked about her past in small pieces, never pressing too hard, and she found herself offering more than she intended, drawn out by his patience rather than pushed by his curiosity. She told him about her training as a physician's apprentice in a city far from Wren Hollow, about the scandal that had ended it, though she stopped short of the details, the wound still too raw even after all these years. She told him about the family she had lost, not to death, but to shame, and how she had wandered from town to town before finally settling in this quiet fishing village, where no one asked questions as long as her hands could save their lives. He listened without judgment, without the pity she had feared for so long, and in return, he began to share pieces of his own life, carefully, as though testing how much weight she could bear before he offered more. He spoke of a father whose health was failing, of a mother whose expectations had never once considered his own happiness, of a life mapped out for him since birth that left no room for choices of his own. "I came here," he admitted one evening, as the sea turned gold beneath the setting sun, "because I needed to remember what it felt like to make a decision that was entirely mine." "And did you find that?" she asked. He turned to look at her then, his expression unguarded in a way she had not seen since the night he first woke in her cottage and asked for her name. "I found something better," he said quietly. "I found you." She did not know how to answer that. Her heart caught somewhere between fear and something warmer than she had allowed herself to feel in years. Before she could find the words, the sound of hooves echoed from the road leading into the village, distant but unmistakable, the rhythm of horses ridden hard and fast. Alaric's expression shifted instantly, the warmth draining from his face, replaced by something tense and wary. Eliza felt the change in him immediately, the way his shoulders straightened, the way his eyes fixed on the road with an intensity that told her whoever was coming, he had been expecting them, and dreading them, all along. "Alaric," she said carefully, "who is that?" He did not answer right away, his jaw tight as the sound of hooves grew louder, closer, until finally, a group of riders crested the hill above the village, their fine clothes and polished horses utterly out of place among the humble cottages of Wren Hollow. He closed his eyes briefly, as though gathering strength for something he had hoped to avoid for just a little longer. "They have found me," he said quietly, "and Eliza, there is something I should have told you days ago." The riders drew their horses to a stop at the edge of the village, and the man at the front, an older gentleman in a dark green coat with silver buttons, dismounted quickly and strode toward the cottage with a mixture of relief and urgency written across his face. "Your Grace," the man said, bowing low the moment he reached Alaric, "we have searched every port and every road for 11 days. Your mother feared the worst." Eliza felt the words land like stones in her chest. "Your Grace." She turned to look at Alaric, searching his face for some explanation, some sign that she had misheard, but his expression only confirmed what the words already told her. "You are a duke," she said quietly, the realization settling over her like cold water. "Eliza," he began, stepping toward her, but she took a step back, her arms crossing over her chest, as though she could shield herself from the sting of his silence over the past days. "You let me believe you were simply a traveler," she said. "A stranger, with nothing but a wound and a name. You let me tell you things I have never told anyone, while you kept the truth of who you are locked away like it did not matter." "It did not matter," he said, his voice urgent now, pleading in a way she had never heard from him before. "Not to what was happening between us. I did not want my title to change how you saw me. And now," she asked, her voice sharper than she intended, "now that I know, will it change how you see me?" "Never," he said immediately, without hesitation, though the word did little to soothe the ache spreading through her chest. The steward, still standing nearby with the patience of a man well used to waiting on matters of nobility, cleared his throat gently. "Your Grace, forgive the intrusion, but your father's condition has worsened. The physicians say his time may be shorter than we feared. Your mother insists you return at once, before the reading of the will, before questions of succession grow more complicated than they already are." Alaric's jaw tightened at the news, worry flashing across his face before he turned back to Eliza, torn between the woman standing before him and the duty calling him away. "I have to go," he said. "But Eliza, I do not want this to be goodbye." She said nothing, her arms still crossed, her mind spinning too quickly to settle on any single thought. 8 lives she had saved before him, and each time, the stranger had healed and left, and she had returned to her quiet solitude without complication, without the ache now blooming behind her ribs. "Come with me," he said suddenly, the words tumbling out before he seemed to fully consider them. "Not as anything more than what you already are, a physician of remarkable skill. My father is ill, and every doctor in the city has failed to ease his suffering. You saved my life when trained physicians would have let me die on a village road. I believe you could save his, too. I do not belong in a duke's house," she said, shaking her head. "I do not belong among people who will look at me and see nothing but a woman without a name, without a family, without a place among them. You have a name," he said gently, "Eliza Marsh, and I am asking you to bring it with you, not to hide it." She wanted to refuse. Every instinct built over years of guarding herself screamed at her to let him ride away and return to the quiet, uncomplicated life she had built for herself in Wren Hollow. But something in his eyes, something desperate and honest beneath the weight of his title, made the refusal catch in her throat before it could fully form. "I need time," she said finally. "Give me until morning." He nodded, though the worry in his eyes did not fade, and he allowed the steward to lead him toward the horses waiting to carry him back to whatever grand and complicated world he had left behind when the storm brought him to her door. That night, Eliza sat alone in her cottage, staring at the empty bed where Alaric had spent the past days recovering, the silence pressing in around her in a way it never had before. She thought of the 8 lives she had saved before him, each one a stranger who had passed briefly through her world, before disappearing back into their own. She had never once felt tempted to follow any of them beyond her doorstep. But Alaric was different, and she knew it, though she was not yet ready to name why. She thought of her own history, the scandal that had stripped her of her family's name, the disgrace that had followed her from city to city until she found refuge in Wren Hollow's quiet anonymity. She had built her entire life around avoiding notice, around remaining small enough that no one would ever again have the power to take something from her the way they had taken everything once before. And yet here was a man asking her to step directly into the kind of world that had destroyed her family, asking her to walk willingly into the reach of judgment and titles and the very people who valued bloodlines over kindness. She did not sleep that night, her mind turning over every possibility, every fear, every fragile hope that had bloomed in her chest over the days she had spent caring for a stranger, who turned out to be so much more than he first appeared. By morning, exhaustion had worn her arguments thin, and as the sun rose over the cliffs, she found herself thinking not of the dangers of the Duke's world, but of the man who had asked her name before anything else, who had learned to stack firewood despite a healing wound simply because idleness troubled him, who had listened to her history without flinching, without judgment, without the pity she had feared for so long. She was still turning the decision over in her mind when a knock came at her door, not the steward this time, but a young messenger boy, breathless from running. "Miss Marsh," he said, bowing awkwardly, unused to such formality. "There is word from the ducal estate. The old duke has taken a sudden turn for the worse. The physicians fear he may not survive the week. The young master," the boy corrected himself quickly, "His Grace, asked that I deliver this to you personally." He held out a folded letter, sealed with wax bearing an emblem she did not recognize, though she suspected she would come to know it well if she chose to follow the path now laid before her. She broke the seal with trembling fingers and read the words written in Alaric's careful hand. "Eliza," the letter began, "I understand if you choose to remain in Wren Hollow, and I will respect that choice without resentment, though it will grieve me more than I can say. But my father's condition has worsened, and the physicians here speak only of comfort, not of cure. I have watched you pull life back from the very edge of death, with nothing but herbs and steady hands and a will stronger than any I have ever known. If there is any chance you could do the same for him, I am asking you, not as a duke commanding a subject, but as a man who trusts you more than anyone else in this world. Please come." Beneath his signature, in smaller writing, as though added after some hesitation, he had written one final line. "I asked for your name because I wanted to know you, not your usefulness. That has not changed, and it never will." She stood in the doorway of her cottage for a long time after reading the letter. the sea wind pulling at the edges of the paper as she stared out toward the horizon where, somewhere beyond it, a dying man waited for a cure his own physicians could not offer. She thought of Mira, the young girl she had saved from fever the previous winter, who had asked her once why she never wanted anything in return for saving lives. She had told the girl, at the time, that saving a life was its own reward, that she needed nothing more than the knowledge that someone would wake the next morning who otherwise would not have. But standing there with Alaric's letter in her hands, she realized, perhaps for the first time in years, that she wanted something more. She wanted to know if the warmth that had grown between them over the past days was real, or if it had only existed within the safe, uncomplicated walls of her cottage, sheltered from the world that had once destroyed her family, and would, if given the chance, judge her all over again. There was only one way to find out. She packed her small bag of herbs and instruments before the sun had fully risen, leaving instructions with old Ned to watch over her cottage in her absence, and promising Mira, who arrived at her door in tears upon hearing she was leaving, that she would return, though even as she said the words, she was not entirely certain they were true. The journey to the ducal estate took the better part of 2 days, the landscape shifting from the humble fishing villages she knew so well into wide, manicured lands, dotted with grand houses, that made her small cottage feel like something from another lifetime entirely. By the time the carriage Alaric had sent for her crested the final hill and the estate came into view, sprawling and magnificent against the afternoon sky, Eliza felt the full weight of what she was walking into settle heavily upon her shoulders. This was not Wren Hollow. There would be no anonymity here, no quiet corner where she could save lives without notice or judgment. Here, every eye would measure her. Every whispered word would question what a nameless healer from a fishing village was doing inside the walls of one of the most powerful families in the region. But as the carriage rolled to a stop and she saw Alaric waiting at the top of the grand stone steps, his relief plain across his face the moment their eyes met, she found the fear inside her settling into something steadier, something that felt, against all her instincts, almost like hope. "You came," he said, moving down the steps to meet her before she had even fully stepped from the carriage. "I came for your father," she said, though even as she spoke the words, she suspected they were not entirely true, and from the way his eyes softened, she suspected he knew it too. "Then let me take you to him," he said, offering his arm. "Though I confess, Eliza, I am equally glad simply to see you again." She placed her hand upon his arm, feeling the eyes of servants and stable hands upon her as they climbed the steps together, and told herself she had come only to save a life, the 9th in a string of many. But deep within her, in a place she had guarded for years, she knew this life, unlike all the others, might cost her far more than the ones that came before it, and she was no longer entirely certain she was prepared to pay that price. The inside of the estate was even grander than its exterior promised, marble floors polished to a mirror shine, portraits of stern ancestors lining walls draped in deep crimson fabric, and a silence so heavy it felt as though the entire house was holding its breath, waiting for news of the dying duke above. Alaric led her swiftly through the halls, past servants who bowed their heads but could not quite hide the curiosity in their eyes as they took in the plainly dressed woman walking beside their master. Eliza kept her chin lifted, refusing to let the weight of their stares bend her posture, though inside, her heart pounded with every step. They had nearly reached the staircase leading to the upper floors when a woman's voice, sharp and cold, cut through the quiet hall. "Alaric, a word if you please." Eliza turned to see a tall woman descending the opposite staircase, dressed in black mourning silk despite the fact that the Duke had not yet passed, her expression carved from the same stone as the estate's grand pillars. This, Eliza understood immediately, was the Duchess. "Mother," Alaric said, his tone carefully measured, "this is Eliza Marsh. She is a physician of remarkable skill. I have brought her to see Father." The Duchess's eyes swept over Eliza with a coldness that made the air in the hall feel colder still, taking in her simple traveling dress, her unpolished boots, the plain leather bag of herbs clutched in her hands. "A physician," she repeated, the word dripping with doubt. "From where, precisely?" "Wren Hollow," Eliza answered, refusing to let her voice waver beneath the Duchess's scrutiny. "A fishing village," the Duchess said, as though the words themselves confirmed every suspicion she already held. "My husband has been attended by the finest physicians in the country, and you believe a village healer will succeed where they have failed?" "I do not believe anything," Eliza said evenly. "I have not yet seen him. But I have saved lives that trained physicians called lost causes, and I would rather try and fail than watch a man die simply because no one was willing to let me attempt what others could not." The Duchess's eyes narrowed, though something in Eliza's steady confidence seemed to give her pause, however briefly. Alaric stepped forward then, his voice firm in a way Eliza had not yet heard from him. She saved my life, Mother, when I was bleeding out on a village road, and every hour mattered. I trust her judgment more than any physician this house has employed. Let her see Father. If she fails, we have lost nothing but time we were already losing. The Duchess held her son's gaze for a long moment, some silent battle passing between them that Eliza could not fully read, before finally stepping aside with a curt nod. See that she does not tire him unnecessarily, she said, before sweeping past them down the hall, her silk skirts whispering against the marble like a warning. Eliza let out a slow breath once the Duchess had disappeared from sight, and Alaric turned to her with an apologetic look. She is not always so cold, he said. She is frightened, though she would never admit it. I understand fear, Eliza said quietly. It rarely wears a kind face. They climbed the remaining stairs together, and Alaric led her into a grand bedchamber where the old Duke lay against a mountain of pillows, his face gaunt and gray, his breathing shallow and labored in a way Eliza recognized instantly as dangerously close to failing entirely. She moved to his bedside without hesitation, setting aside every worry about titles and judgment, focusing instead on the fading pulse beneath her fingers as she checked his wrist, the faint tremor in his hands, the color of his lips and the rasp of his breath. Father, Alaric said gently, sitting on the opposite side of the bed, this is Eliza. She has come to help you. The old Duke's eyes fluttered open slowly, clouded with pain and exhaustion, though something sharp still lingered within them as they settled upon Eliza's face. He studied her for a long moment, his brow furrowing as though searching through years of memory for something just out of reach. Marsh, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. That name. I knew a physician once, in my youth, by that very name. Eliza's hand stilled against his wrist, her own pulse quickening at his words. That was my father, she said carefully, Edwin Marsh. He practiced medicine in the capital, many years ago, before he lost everything. The old Duke's eyes widened slightly, recognition and something that looked strikingly like guilt crossing his weathered face. Edwin Marsh, he repeated. I remember him well. A brilliant physician, ruined by accusations that were never proven. Accusations my own family had a hand in spreading, to protect a debt we owed him that we had no intention of repaying. Eliza felt the room tilt slightly beneath her, the pieces of her father's ruin, pieces she had never fully understood, suddenly rearranging themselves into a shape she had never expected to find inside the walls of a ducal estate. Alaric too looked stunned, his eyes moving between his father and Eliza as the weight of the revelation settled over the room. I did not know, Alaric said quietly. Nor did I. Until this moment, Eliza said, her voice tight with a mixture of old grief and new understanding. The old Duke reached for her hand then, his grip weaker than she expected, though his eyes held a plea she recognized instantly, the same plea she had seen in the eyes of dying men and women for years before this one. Whatever debt my family owes yours, he said, his breath rattling with the effort of speaking, I do not ask you to forgive it. I only ask that you save me long enough to make it right. Eliza looked down at the dying man before her, a man whose family had destroyed her father's name, and, in doing so, unraveled the entire life she had once known. Every instinct built from years of quiet solitude urged her to walk away, to let the debt remain unpaid, to let the family that had ruined hers face the consequences of its own making. But she thought of her father, who despite everything, had taught her that a healer's duty was to the body before her, not to the grievances of the past. She thought of the 8 lives she had already saved without asking for anything in return, and she understood, in that moment, that walking away now would betray not the Duke's family, but the very principle that had carried her through every dark year since her family's fall. I will do everything I can, she said finally, and she meant it, not for the Duke's title, not for his family's debt, but for the simple, unwavering truth that a life was a life, regardless of the name attached to it. She worked through the night and into the following day, mixing herbs she had brought from Wren Hollow with others gathered from the estate's own gardens, monitoring the Duke's breathing and pulse with a vigilance that left her exhausted but unwilling to rest. Alaric remained at her side throughout, fetching what she needed, holding his father's hand through the worst of the fever that gripped him near dawn, watching Eliza work with a mixture of awe and gratitude that she felt even through her exhaustion. By the second evening, the fever finally broke, and the old Duke's breathing steadied into something stronger, something that no longer rattled with each labored breath. Eliza sat back from the bed, her hands trembling with fatigue, and allowed herself, for the first time in 2 days, a small, quiet moment of relief. He will live, she said softly, and Alaric, who had not left the room in over a day, closed his eyes and let out a breath that sounded very much like a prayer finally answered. The ninth life, she thought, though this one felt different from all the others, tangled as it was with her own family's history, with debts and betrayals decades old, with a man who now looked at her not with mere gratitude, but with something far deeper, something that made the walls she had spent years building feel suddenly, dangerously fragile. In the days that followed, as the old Duke slowly regained his strength, word spread through the estate of the healer from Wren Hollow who had succeeded where the finest physicians in the country had failed. Servants began to greet her with genuine warmth rather than curious stares. The Duchess, though still guarded, softened enough to offer Eliza a quiet word of thanks, the closest thing to an apology Eliza suspected the woman was capable of giving. But amid the gratitude and the mending of old wounds, both physical and otherwise, Eliza found herself facing a decision she had not anticipated when she first agreed to leave Wren Hollow. The old Duke, grateful beyond measure for the life she had saved, offered to restore her family's name, to grant her the recognition and property her father had lost decades before, to welcome her not as a village healer, but as a woman with a rightful place among the very families that had once destroyed her own. It was everything she might once have dreamed of reclaiming. And yet, standing in the grand halls of the estate, surrounded by silk and marble and the weight of a world she had spent years avoiding, she found herself missing the salt air of Wren Hollow, the simple gratitude of villagers who asked nothing of her but her steady hands, the quiet anonymity that had, for so long, kept her safe from a world that measured worth by name and title, rather than by the lives she had saved. She thought of Alaric, of the way he had asked for her name before anything else, of the quiet devotion he had shown throughout his father's illness, and she understood that whatever choice she made now would decide far more than where she would live. It would decide whether she was ready, after years of hiding, to finally step back into the world as herself, fully known, fully seen, with all the risk and vulnerability that came with it. She did not know, standing there amid the mended peace of the estate, which path she would choose, but for the first time in years, she found that the uncertainty did not frighten her nearly as much as she once believed it would. Word of the old Duke's recovery spread quickly beyond the estate walls, carried by servants to neighboring households and by visiting relatives to the drawing rooms of the capital, until within a fortnight, the name Eliza Marsh had become a quiet topic of fascination among the very circles that had once destroyed her father. She felt the shift the moment she stepped into any room within the estate, the way conversations paused, the way eyes followed her with a mixture of curiosity and something closer to respect than she had known in years. Alaric watched the change in how the household treated her with quiet satisfaction, though Eliza herself remained wary, unable to fully trust a warmth that had arrived so suddenly after years of being invisible to the world she now found herself standing within. She spent her mornings tending to the old Duke, whose strength continued to return with each passing day, and her afternoons walking the estate gardens with Alaric, their conversations drifting easily between memories of Wren Hollow and the uncertain shape of whatever came next. It was during one such afternoon, beneath the shade of an ancient oak at the edge of the garden, that Alaric finally spoke the words she had sensed building in him since the night his father's fever broke. "I have spoken with my mother," he said, his hands clasped behind his back in a manner she had come to recognize as nervousness, though he wore it well beneath his usual composure. "I have told her that I intend to marry you, Eliza, not as a physician retained by this family, and not as a debt owed to your father's memory, but as the woman I love, fully and without condition." Eliza felt her breath catch, the words landing with a weight she had not fully prepared herself for, despite the warmth that had grown steadily between them over the past weeks. "And what did she say?" Eliza asked carefully, though she suspected she already knew. "She reminded me of every reason such a match would be considered unsuitable," he admitted. "Your family's scandal, however unjustly caused, the absence of title or fortune, the whispers that would follow us at every gathering for years to come." "And what did you tell her?" Eliza pressed, her heart pounding despite the calm she forced into her voice. "I told her that the woman who saved my life, and then saved my father's, deserves far more respect than any title could grant her, and that I would rather face a lifetime of whispers at her side than a lifetime of comfort without her," he said, finally turning to face her fully, his eyes steady and unguarded in the way she had come to treasure since the very first night she pulled him from the edge of death. Eliza looked away, toward the distant line of the sea barely visible beyond the estate's rolling hills, and felt the old fears rising within her, the ones she had carried since the day her family's name became a mark of shame rather than pride. "Alaric," she said quietly, "you do not understand what it means to carry a name that opens doors only to have them slammed shut the moment people remember what that name once meant. I spent years building a life where no one needed to know it at all. I do not know if I am ready to carry it back into a world that will judge me for every syllable of it." He stepped closer then, taking her hands gently in his thumbs brushing over the calluses she had earned through years of tending to others without ever once tending fully to herself. "I am not asking you to carry your name for the world," he said softly. "I am asking you to carry it because it is yours, because your father did nothing to deserve the shame placed upon it, and because I would rather stand beside the real Eliza Marsh, scandal and all, than beside a woman pretending to be someone smaller than she truly is." She felt tears gathering, unbidden, at the corners of her eyes. Tears she had not allowed herself in years, not since the night her family's world collapsed and she had promised herself she would never again be vulnerable enough to be hurt so deeply. "Why me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of all the women in your world, women with titles and fortunes and names that open doors instead of closing them, why choose the one who has spent her entire adult life trying to disappear?" "Because you never once tried to disappear when someone needed saving," he said. "Because I watched you give everything you had to 8 strangers before me, and a 9th after, without ever asking what it would cost you. Because the very first night I woke in your cottage, half convinced I was dying, the thing I wanted most was not water, or rest, or reassurance that I would survive. It was simply to know your name, because somehow, even through the fever, I understood that whoever you were, you mattered more than anything else in that room." She let out a shaky breath, the walls she had spent years constructing finally beginning to crack beneath the weight of his words, beneath the simple, unwavering truth of a man who had asked for her name before he had known anything else about her, and had continued asking, in every way that mattered, ever since. "I am frightened," she admitted, the confession costing her more than any wound she had ever tended. "Not of you, but of everything that comes with you, the title, the scrutiny, the chance that one day, the world will decide I am not enough, the same way it decided about my father. Then let us be frightened together," Alaric said, "and let the world see that we chose each other anyway." The wedding, when it finally came weeks later, was smaller than the grand affairs typically hosted by ducal families, a choice Alaric insisted upon out of respect for Eliza's wishes, though even a smaller gathering among the nobility felt overwhelming to a woman who had spent years avoiding notice entirely. The old duke, fully recovered and walking without assistance for the first time in months, stood at the ceremony with tears in his eyes, a debt finally repaid not through property or title, but through the simple joy of watching his son marry a woman who had saved them both. The Duchess, though still reserved in her affections, had softened considerably over the preceding weeks, offering Eliza a piece of jewelry that had belonged to her own mother, a small gesture that spoke more clearly than any words could of the quiet acceptance she had finally allowed herself to feel. Old Ned and Mira traveled from Wren Hollow for the occasion, the young girl clutching Eliza's hand throughout the ceremony as though afraid she might vanish back into the grand world of the estate and never return to the village that had first given her refuge. Eliza had promised her, and meant it fully this time, that Wren Hollow would always remain a part of her life, that the cottage on the cliffs would stand ready for whenever she needed to return to the quiet, salt-scented air that had once saved her as surely as she had saved so many others. Standing before the small gathering, as the officiant spoke the words that would bind her life to Alaric's, Eliza found herself thinking not of the grand estate now surrounding her, nor of the title she would carry from that day forward, but of a stormy night 2 years and countless lifetimes ago, when a wounded stranger had looked at her through a haze of fever and asked the one question no one else had ever thought to ask. When the ceremony ended and the small crowd began to disperse toward the celebration awaiting them within the estate's grand hall, Alaric drew her aside for a quiet moment beneath the same ancient oak where he had first spoken of marriage, away from the noise and the watching eyes that would follow them for the rest of their days. "Do you remember," he asked, "the first night you saved me?" "I remember every detail," she said, smiling despite the exhaustion of the day. "I do not forget the lives I save." He reached up, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face, his eyes holding hers with the same steady patience she had come to rely upon more than she ever thought possible. "I asked for your name that night," he said, "because some part of me already knew, even through the fever, that you were the first person in my entire life who had ever looked at me and seen a man rather than a title, an obligation, or a prize to be secured through marriage. You saved my life before you knew anything about me, and you gave me your name only once you trusted that I wanted you, not what you could offer me." Eliza felt the truth of his words settle over her, warm and certain, chasing away the last remnants of fear that had followed her for so many years. She thought of the 8 lives before him, each one grateful, each one gone, and she understood now, standing beneath the oak tree in the golden light of her wedding day, that none of them had ever asked the question that mattered most, the question that had, in the end, saved her as surely as she had once saved him. "You were the first man who asked my name," she said softly, "and the first who made me want to remember it, rather than bury it." He smiled then, the kind of smile she had only seen a handful of times in the 2 years since the storm first brought him to her door, unguarded, certain, and entirely hers. "Then let us make certain," he said, taking her hand as they turned back toward the estate and the life now waiting for them both, "that it is a name the world remembers for far better reasons than the ones that once tried to bury it." Together, they walked back toward the light and warmth of the gathering, leaving behind, at last, the years of hiding and the weight of names once carried in shame, and stepping instead into a future built not on titles or debts, but on the simple, enduring truth that had brought them together in the first place, that some lives are worth saving not because of who they are, but because of who they have the courage to become.